let's go take a look at what breakouts happen most often. In an individual year, what type of breakouts do we see, and what does that mean for 2021? So this is a table. Obviously I've got it broken down by year just so you can literally see where the breakouts happen, and this is bucketed now. So these are players who hit certain threshold levels of position rank inside the top 5, inside the top 12, inside the top 24 for the very first time. Not how many they have, not how far inside the top 24 they are. It's also broken down by position at running back, wide receiver, quarterback, and tight end. And so you can see on a yearly basis, we have a lot of breakouts if you take into account all 3 different thresholds. And I did a nice average table down here at the bottom, just try and see some trends, create some expectations for 2021, and a 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year trend just to see what's really been popping lately. In fact, let's see. Yeah, that's better, right? Get my fat head out the way. So, one thing I notice, right now I have it filtered to all players, so players in every career year, because I was also trying to filter this through a Dynasty perspective to specifically just an individual season perspective. Now in Dynasty, we're mostly interested in players breakout year 1 to 3, by and large, because those have the most Dynasty value, and also the ones that raise in value the most, and so we tend to target them pretty heavily. But if you notice, based on 2022, like DK Metcalf and AJ Brown were 2 of those second year breakouts last year, and so was Deontay Johnson at 2 different thresholds. But we also have Stefon Diggs breaking out in year 6 into the top 5, not breaking out for the first time because he'd broken out earlier than that. In fact, players who have broken out at lower thresholds earlier in the career are more likely to continue to produce, although there's actually some interesting trends and rules you can develop, which I recently have been written up for DLF, based on whether a player is going to break into a threshold fresh, as in having never broken into another threshold, or break into a threshold for the first time. For example, while looking at third-year wide receiver breakouts, for DLF, what I found is if a player is going to break into the top 12, most often, like extremely commonly, they've already broken into the top 24. So if you're looking for a player to break out in their third year, which is the second most common breakout year for a wide receiver at most of the thresholds, then you're really looking for someone who has been productive before. And so I broke them down, and what we found is Terry McLaurin and Deontay Johnson are the most likely because they have hit a top 24 threshold before. But then you have some other interesting names like Marcus Brown, Jacoby Myers, New England's wide receiver 1. Hat tip to Cooper Adams over there at DLF. Also Darius Slayton, Hunter Renfrow, and Deebo Samuel. And I wrote up the ones I thought that were most interesting, which is really Deebo Samuel and Marcus Brown outside of those top 2. Because something that you can notice, if you take into account all career years, we see most breakouts most years. And this middle column, for example, is telling you the number of years out of the sample size we're looking at years have happened. So 10 out of 12 years we've seen a quarterback break into the top 5 for the first time. That's pretty common at 83%. 10 out of 12 years we've seen a quarterback break into the top 12 for the first time since 2009. That's around 83%. That sounds like a really high number until you realize all the other thresholds are literally at 100%. Like, we see every type of breakout every year if you take into account all players at every career year. Now, if you filter just by those Dynasty players that we tend to be hunting, something interesting happens, and this is what I was talking about on Twitter, that we seem to limit top 5 upside if you're only interested in players playing in their first 3 years, like the players I listed in that article, because we lose between 20 and 40% of all players that break out inside the top 5 if we're only looking at year 1, 2, and 3. If we start to take into account players that are playing in year 4, 5, and 6, like Stefon Diggs last year, then we get the majority of breakouts. So if you're specifically looking at 2021, you need, for production or breakout, you actually limit your upside if you're only looking at young players or younger players. And now, bear in mind, that doesn't mean you're just looking at brand new old players. Like Mike Williams has been out there forever. Maybe he's a top 5. I don't think so, based on that particular take. But you're also looking for players who have broken previous thresholds when looking at the third-year breakout. So if we combine this with the hit rate table that we've got in the other tab, that we see most top 12 and most top 5 breakouts happen in year 3. And that's, back to the article I wrote for DLF, where most players who hit either threshold have actually had crossed an earlier threshold earlier in their career. Alright, so don't discount rookies. There's very likely to be at least one rookie who finishes inside one of the thresholds, because that has happened every year except one since 2009, for example. But you're not expecting 2020. That's not news. Alright. Moving on. The other thing I noticed is we've been pretty much at or below average in the running back threshold. This goes to the 2020 running backs being expected to break into year 2, because again, if we combine this to the hit rate table in the other tab, with these second year breakouts at the running back position are fairly common at both the top 5 and top 12 levels. Now again, year 1 is really the most common breakout year, which is why Najee Harris and ETN and Javonte Williams might be being slightly underdrafted right now, because we're trying to push up all those sophomore running backs as well. But those sophomore running backs make a pretty good case for themselves, since, running backs breaking into the top 5 for the first time, the most common year for that is that second year, and so that's good news for DeAndre Swift and Antonio Gibson and all of your 2020 running backs that you really love and want to go draft. All right. Last conclusion, I guess I'm going to finish with in this video at least, is that we have been remarkably lucky in terms of high-end production over the last 3 years at the quarterback position. This isn't, again, something new. This fits with our fields, right? We've got Justin Herbert breaking out, and we've got all these young quarterbacks just balling out all the time, but that means over a 1 and 2 and 3 year trend, we have seen an excess number of players break into the top 5 for the first time. For example, last year, who was it? Give me a second, that function really takes a minute. Josh Allen and Kyler Murray, both within their first 3 years, both broke out into the top 5 for the first time. So that's 2 quarterbacks, and on average we get about 1.4. 1 player instead of 2 players. So we have been a little bit lucky at that top 5 threshold. But if you're looking at top 12 and top 24 threshold, we have seen a lack or a below average of the last 3 year trend, quarterbacks breaking into that threshold. Now, weirdly, this pushed me to some names that I'm not particularly fond of. Now, a couple of the names like Joe Burrow and Tua Tagovailoa, I'm actually really excited about this year, especially based on their ADP and on the fact that Tua is being faded essentially, even though we haven't seen him play in the NFL. Joe Burrow, there's a slight injury concern, which I can't really speak to myself, but he is set up to break out in the most common year that quarterbacks break into the top 12, for example. And we've seen a lack of that happening over the last 3 year trend, and so that all seems to speak well for Joe Burrow and Tua Tagovailoa. But we also see that top 24 breakouts and top 12 breakouts also happen second most often, like a wide receiver, in that third year. That's not particularly a group of quarterbacks that I'm particularly interested in, particularly, just to throw out one more particularly, because that's the Daniel Jones and Drew Lock category. However, I don't know. New York Giants are trying to retool their entire offense and run it into the ground in practice, apparently, starting fights and all sorts of stuff. They did get Kenny Golladay, who now has a hamstring strain and hasn't shown much in camp. Not that I care too much, and Evan Ingram has had a drop and a touchdown problem the last few years. I could easily see Drew Lock and Daniel Jones have an improved year and not particularly rise in Dynasty, but at least be supporting significant fantasy assets that they haven't been the last few years, in Kenny Golladay, in Evan Ingram, in Cortland Sutton, in Jerry Jeudy, and maybe a little bit deeper down those depth charts. Seth Williams is down there on the Denver depth chart, right? Probably not, but I still like to remember his name. He was a pretty decent rookie prospect. You've also got KJ Hamler, who's a decent rookie prospect at one point. Noah Fant on Denver. Those weapons could help them have their first season inside the top 12, inside the top 24 at best, and that return this average trend back to 0 and kind of fulfill the prophecy, if this is a trend at all. And it is interesting. Mostly for either of those teams, I'm mostly interested in their skill positions more than their quarterbacks. But if you have them on your team, it is worth knowing that Daniel Jones and Drew Lock might well produce a little bit better than they have been doing, just based on the way careers flow and based on what's happening recently.
Hey there. Subscribe to my channel. And also press this bell icon.
Also, maybe we won't see many top 5 breakouts of the quarterback position, which also fits my feelings on this season. We've been blessed with a whole plethora of breakouts and phenomenal quarterback production lately. I don't think it's going to drop off or disappear. I just think the escalation of Dynasty feels towards the quarterback position is going to plateau a little bit. Don't devalue any quarterbacks for that, but don't be immediately expecting this, frankly, very high quality draft class, as far as I can tell, at the quarterback position. We've got at least 3 or 4 quarterbacks in here are really interesting, but expecting them to do it year one might be a little exaggerated in general, and based on the last 3 years, we've been seeing that a lot, and so on average, you wouldn't expect that to happen very often. I'm just telling you, above the average of the last 3 years. Anyway, and so those were my main 3 conclusions. You're limiting top 5 upside if you're not looking at slightly older players to break into those top 5 at any of the positions, by the way. Also, we're less likely to see a wide receiver breakout this year into the top 12 specifically, although there is an interesting category based on where those players in that article I wrote up's ADPs are at. And running backs are much more likely to break out in 2021 than wide receivers, based on this 1, 2, and 3 year trend of the most common breakouts that have happened since 2009 or so. Anyway, those are some of my conclusions. I haven't looked over this data for way too long. I hope you think it's an interesting look. I think it's interesting to see, and I find it really interesting because we tend to be, curmudgeons like me, we tend to be less excited about a player doing something for the first time because it seems just so optimistic, and I like to be so negative. But to be fair, we do see at least one version of most breakouts happen every year. And in fact, the running back position we see, especially within their first 3 years, it happened at least twice. At wide receiver, we happen to see it at least once, especially within those first 3 years, and so on and so forth. We apply the general rules after that. So yeah, that's about it, I think.